Hello and welcome back for our afternoon session on delivering government policy through regulation. I'm Matthew Gill. If you've just joined us online, this is the second session of our conference on regulation in a changing world, how to meet the needs of the future, kindly sponsored by Water UK. Just to recap some housekeeping briefly, if you're watching online, please do send your questions in as early as you like via Slido, which is the panel next to the screen, and do tell us your name and where you're viewing from. It's always great to see that. For those in the room, a microphone will be available during the Q&A portion of the event, so do start thinking about what questions you might want to ask later. We've heard from the Regulation Minister, Blair McDougall, earlier this afternoon on the importance of good regulation in promoting growth. But we also heard that growth is just one outcome that government might want regulators to help deliver. And other objectives, some of which are related to growth, might include competitive markets, fair treatment of consumers and the public, environmental sustainability, resilience to shocks, innovation and responsiveness to change, and as we'll discuss more in a later session, long-term investment in infrastructure. So I'm delighted to welcome this panel to discuss the purpose of regulation and particularly its relationship to government policy. How can the government balance all of these objectives while giving regulators the independence they need and minimising the burdens at the same time? Surely that's not too much to ask. So to help us with some of the answers, I'd like to introduce my panel. Beginning on my far right, we have Caleb Deeks, who is the Director General for Competition Markets and Regulatory Reform at the Department for Business and Trade. He's been at the centre of UK economic and regulatory policy for many years, working across DBT, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. Thank you for joining us, Caleb. Natalie Prosser is the Chief Executive Officer of the Office for Environmental Protection. She's previously been General Counsel at the Gambling Commission and Director of Operations and Legal at Ofqual. Very warm welcome to you, Natalie. To my left is Lord Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator. He'll be known to many of you as a senior Conservative politician, a former cabinet minister and a journalist, and he's a current member of the House of Lords. Welcome, Michael. And finally, on my far left, Dame Clare Moriarty is Chief Executive of Citizens Advice. She's previously held permanent secretary roles in major government departments with responsibility for key policy areas such as the environment and Brexit. Very good to have you with us, Clare.
Thank you.
So thank you all very much. I want to start really by picking up where we left off with the Minister and thinking a little bit about the role of regulation in growth. So, Caleb, what does the government see as the purpose of regulation, particularly with respect to growth? Is it a precondition of fair markets, or is it a policy lever that government uses to achieve other things?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I mean, look, I don't think there is a single purpose of regulation, right? It's just one of the fundamental tools that all governments have, alongside taxing people, spending money, providing services. And so as policymakers, I think, where government has got an objective, whether that's about the environment or about public safety, regulation is a possibility, but it's not the only option. And as we've heard in some of the conversations we've had already today, there are some drawbacks to regulation. And I think it's worth thinking about, first of all, whether there are alternatives, because the drawbacks are clearly that it takes a while to do, it takes a while to change, and it's inflexible. And in an economy like ours, you're layering regulation upon regulation, which adds to the complexity of the environment that businesses have to operate in. So I think the first question is, you've got an objective. Regulation may be one way of achieving it, but is it actually the best way of doing it? If there is a case for regulation, then how it is done is incredibly important. And there's some really well-established principles about good regulation, about being proportionate, about being targeted, about being transparent, consistent, the right sort of accountability. And again, those kind of themes came out in lots of what you were saying, I think, David, about what good should look like. And to do that properly, we need to have diligent work that understands the markets, understands the stakeholders. And we've got a system, the RPC came up earlier, we've got a good system, I think, of providing a degree of transparency about what those costs are for people in Parliament and elsewhere. And that's really important. And then turning to the sort of second part of your question about, is regulation a lever for economic growth, and does the government think that it is? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I think there's sort of at least three aspects to that. First of all, there's removing unnecessary barriers and burdens, and often that is in the how of regulation. And the Minister talked about the target the government has to cut the administrative burden of regulation by £5.6 billion, or 25%. Actually, for a small business that employs somebody, that's equivalent to 200 hours. And I think that's a more tangible way for me of thinking about that, because that's a real opportunity cost, particularly for a small business where it's possibly the person that's running it that's spending that time, and they could be developing a new product or getting some new customers. So that's one route to growth. And in the last survey we did, around half of businesses said that regulation was a barrier to their success. So it is felt out there. And again, as you heard this morning, we're making progress on that. We've got further to go, but we published this update last week, which showed that on a net basis, we've identified 2 billion of savings. 1.5 of those are delivered. The rest are in progress, but we've got more to identify and more to do. Second thing is where regulation supports the right sort of confidence for markets to operate, and that goes to your point about where does it fit with the market. And if you take one of my sort of favourite bits of regulation, which is limited liability, right? The whole of the kind of modern economic system is built on that bit of regulation. Of course, we've got to keep on challenging it and seeing if it's modern and works well, but it gives companies and others the confidence to invest, to lend, to do business with each other. It's fundamentally important, and it's unlocked a huge amount of growth. And I think that applies in some cases to new technologies where you do need some regulation to give the confidence to operate. It might be consumers having the confidence to buy something new or to engage in a sort of new way of service provision. So that's another route. And then the third, I think, important one is where regulation supports dynamic markets. And we know that competition is hugely important for growth. It's also really important for consumer choice. And in some cases, you need some regulation to underpin that, whether that's about price transparency or whatever. So I don't think that's completely exhaustive, but those would be some of the means. And I think we've got actions underway on all three of those.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. So competition, confidence, and reduced burdens. Natalie, you're the first real live regulator we've got on our panels this afternoon. So how does this approach by government towards policy in relation to regulation actually affect you? And how is the OEP supporting economic growth without losing sight of your other core objectives?
Of course, and I think what we bring from the OEP is that we oversee the work of a lot of regulators across a very broad system. So we're quite uniquely placed to see regulation in practice when it works and also when it doesn't. But it's quite easy for us at OEP to frame our work in relation to economic growth. DEFRA has been very clear in framing itself as a growth department, and that is because it has a priority objective of delivering what we might call green infrastructure. And I think you can go down a little bit of a rabbit hole in environmental world, and you can forget that green infrastructure is a national asset. We heard David talking about the very real impact of a lack of investment in water infrastructure that is directly affecting both our ability to manage wastewater and to provide water for development. It is a massive brake on growth that sector has been regulated in the way that it has, and we are paying a price for it now. That's equally true when you're looking at something like biodiversity, which sounds like, sometimes think, a fluffy, nice thing to have. But we are dependent on nature for food, for air, for water. These are absolutely essential. So it's very easy for us at the OEP to link into that. The thing that I think is really the most important driver in the environmental sector is a really clear and unrelenting focus on outcomes. And Paul Kissat, the new PermSec in DEFRA, has set out really clear and unambiguous outcomes that he wants to achieve, and that includes clean and plentiful water. It includes sustainable development, a development that we're not borrowing from the future and provides good places for people to live and grow. And we look at our work through that lens. We start all of our work in terms of outcomes. So work we've done recently has been about why are our rivers so polluted? What has gone wrong in the system that has allowed that degree of pollution to happen? Why are we seeing bird populations declining even though we have a framework for protecting birds? Why are our seas so polluted when government has a legal target to achieve good ecological status? And these have real world impacts. So we look at everything we do through the lens of how can we better enable this system to deliver the outcomes that it was intended? And if that works well, that should also deliver a resilient, growing economy. And I think resilience is just as important as growth. Now, that's not to say that there are not major problems in the operations of environmental regulation. There absolutely are. And one of the things that we are starting to explore at the OEP is where we see evidence that either regulations themselves or how they are operationalised in practice are actively pulling against delivering those outcomes. So if you are a trusted partner, if you're a wildlife trust, or if you're the National Trust or the RSPB, and you want to invest in nature recovery, is regulation helping you do that, or is it getting in the way? And we will have a real focus on that. And the last thing I want to say about an area that I think is seriously underdeveloped and which has huge potential, and that's nature markets. So nature markets would exist to bring in huge amounts of potential private finance into nature recovery. But in many respects, and I hear this when I talk to people in business, you need regulation to set up the market. So the good example of a nature market at the moment is biodiversity net gain, came into force in 2024. It's going to be rolled out for NSIPs in 2026. Government has already consulted twice on changes to that regime. What that does is it destabilises an emerging market, it undermines investor confidence, and it makes it a riskier endeavour for those that want to bring private finance into nature recovery. And I think there is a huge opportunity for regulation to create a market that would allow something that's investable and will deliver serious public goods for our nation.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And I mean, obviously a lot there in ways in which regulators can take a lead on delivering some of this. Michael, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, if you like, the division of labour between the politicians and the regulator here, because there are some instances where it's harder for the regulator to take a lead. We heard earlier about the sort of trade-off between bills and investment, which if you look over the long term, investment might bring bills down, but in the short term, there's definitely a tension. And so, how specific a role should government play in stating what those trade-offs are? And what decisions can be delegated to a regulator?
So you put your finger absolutely on the heart of it. I worked with different types of regulator in the different roles that I had in government. Let me first of all begin by saying something welcome to representatives of water companies in this room and to Water UK in particular. There's very little good news for water companies at the moment, but one piece of good news is an apology on behalf of all governments to water companies, which is that, as you quite rightly point out, we have asked too much, or rather, more to the point, we've asked conflicting things at conflicting times. So overall, the pressure on water companies through most of the time that I was in government was to keep bills low. It's the cost of living, stupid. The last thing we need is to see water bills rise when there are other pressures. The water companies, understandably, but more importantly, the regulator thought, fair enough, pretty clear. That's the priority. However, that meant both a lack of investment in dealing with, the basics of infrastructure, leaks, because of the ancient nature of our water supply system, and also, as was subsequently shown, a lack of investment in effective handling of wastewater and overflows. I should say as a footnote that we are in a better position to know exactly what is happening in our water system as a result of some of the additional monitoring that was brought about by my colleague and predecessor at DEFRA, Richard Benyon. But the critical thing is that the overall priority that was felt by the regulator was keep those bills down, and politicians weren't clear enough with the public about what those trade-offs might involve. That's not to absolve Ofwat, or for that matter, the Environment Agency or others of some operational failures, but ultimately it's ministerial responsibility in arguably being clear about a priority, but not clear about the trade-off. A couple of other areas. One area where I think we did bring clarity in regulation was with examinations. Here, I must thank my predecessor, Ed Balls, in setting up Ofqual, an independent regulator spun out of the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority. Before Ed came to be Education Secretary, every August when GCSE and A-level results were announced, the celebration of young people was tinged with the cynicism of the media and parents at how much easier it was to pass exams. This was unfair on the children. It was also, however, true. If one looked at the improved exam performance of this country relative to our performance in international league tables, it was clear that we had grade inflation. Ofqual was established to end that. Now, every minister will say, oh, that's a very good thing, honesty in exams results. The difficulty came when the body that Ed created, under the chairmanship of people whom I appointed, said in a particular row over the grading of GCSE English that some people who expected to have higher results and some schools that expected to have higher results would not, in the interests of maintaining exam quality. It was difficult for me because some of the individual cases were children who'd worked incredibly hard, and some of the schools hardest hit were schools that I'd praised, academies, free schools, that I naturally wanted to see flourish. There was a dilemma for me. Should I say to the regulator, ease off and bring relief to individual children who may have faced, in specific circumstances, an injustice, and also at the same time show confidence and faith in those schools who were broadly doing the right thing, but who may have been a little over optimistic in their expectation of what the children should do? Or should I stand behind the regulator and demonstrate that we were serious about dealing with grade inflation? Whatever temptations I might have felt, my deputy was Nick Gibb, so there was never really any choice. I had to stand behind the regulator, and in so doing, we were able to demonstrate that rigour and honesty about exams came ahead of political convenience. So that's down to political leadership, first by Ed Balls, secondly by Nick Gibb. Two other things that I would mention. Sometimes within what appears to be clarity rests ambiguity. So if one says to the Competition and Markets Authority, your mandate is growth, that's fair enough. But then growth can mean different things. Does growth mean that you take an approach towards competition that says that if an organisation has too much market share, what is too much? That you need to put steps in place. Do you measure competition by size of market share or the existence of barriers to entry? But sometimes even if you're doing that and you're involved in that theology about competition, there's a bigger issue, which this government has faced. This government in the past basically said, and I'm oversimplifying here, on the whole, we prefer tech giants to come in because we want their investment because it will bring growth, even at the cost of competition. That is a pro-growth argument, but it also weakens the CMA's remit as classically understood. Now, that might be the right thing to do, but what one's been able to infer is by action rather than by explicit statement what the policy has been, and also a head rolled in order to reinforce that. Final thing that I would say is, on the whole, you want to give regulators autonomy. Ideally, as I said with Ofqual earlier, give a clear mandate, then the regulator comes up with rules. If the rules are uncomfortable, then live with it, because ultimately the virtue overall of your original judgment will be vindicated over time, even if you've been sacked in the interim. And that's the approach that the Office of Environmental Protection has taken. But sometimes there can be the wrong sort of autonomy. What do I mean by that? In financial regulation, it has been the case that our financial regulators have gone rogue. They have been influenced by concerns about board makeup or consumer safety. Bogus citizens, not the Citizens Advice Bureau, bogus organisations claiming to speak for the public interest have piled additional regulation on financial services providers that have added significantly to cost without actually reducing risk. And for the regulator, it is easier to say to the civil society organisation, yeah, sure, absolutely, you know, diversity, safety, whatever the abstract noun is, rather than thinking overall about what their principal mission is. And on that occasion, you do sometimes need political leadership either to say, do you know what, we back up the regulator. That's completely right. Public, we do put additional bureaucracy ahead of efficiency because it's your safety that matters to us. Great. Let the voter decide on that. Or, what are you doing? Your job is to make sure that you're dealing with corruption and malfeasance and market distortion, not making sure that someone fills out a 72 question questionnaire before you then talk to them about some of the most basic financial product sales. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. And that's teed up Clare unenviably to try and inject the voice of the citizen into this discussion. I mean, the question I wanted to ask you was whether consumers, citizens hold regulators or politicians or some combination of both accountable for outcomes here, and what their priorities are when they look at the regulatory landscape and how it should be run.
Yes. Well, I mean, spoiler alert, broadly speaking, consumers don't spend a lot of time thinking about the wiring of the regulatory landscape, nor necessarily even about regulation itself. You know, what consumers are concerned about is they want to know that things will work. They want to know that they won't be taken advantage of, that they won't be overcharged, and they want to have somewhere to go if things go wrong. I mean, it's a fairly fundamental set of things that should work, and you know that should just be how markets work. But we know that in some markets, because of the way they're structured, you know, in order to make those things happen, there is a need for action. And broadly speaking, that's what I'm going to describe as regulation. So regulation is something that can help those things happen. So at Citizens Advice, we see all the time, we see people's problems that are linked to the way that businesses, especially businesses in essential markets like utilities and financial services, treat their customers. And what regulation can do by changing some of the incentives, the reward and risk structure, is reduce the harm that can deliver to people. Ideally, fixing things upstream by creating the conditions that cause companies to behave in a way that treats their customers well, rather than you know, putting lots of kind of bits of sticking plaster on the system to deal with observed things that have gone wrong. I mean, and so sort of within that context, I mean, do people hold regulators or politicians accountable? I mean, again, I suspect that not many consumers are thinking about the question in those terms. Again, they want the system to work. But you know, as Michael has been saying, you know, it's politicians who set the parameters for regulation. You know, ministers create the architecture, they introduce regulators, you know, they give them regulatory policy statements. You know, it all flows back to what politicians think are the important things to put around it. And I mean, in that context, just thinking about how consumers then see what's happening. So we did some recent polling. 8% of consumers said that the government does enough to protect ordinary consumers, 8% in the way it deals with big businesses like banks and energy companies. 47% said that the government was overly cautious or just does what industry wants in their dealings. 71% of the people polled thought that in a dispute between a customer and a large company providing an essential service, the company has the stronger position, and only 14% felt that power is balanced. So this is, you know, fundamentally, the vast majority of what we deal with at Citizens Advice is about people on the wrong sides of imbalances of power. And those are, you know, structural in all sorts of ways, in the way that our markets work, and regulation can be one of the things that helps rebalance that power. I think another key thing is, I mean, when we talk about regulation, often what we're talking about is the rules, and we talk about regulators. What we see is a kind of ecosystem that all has to work together. One of the things about Citizens Advice is that we treat people as people, and we see their problems in the round, and we recognise that the thing that brings somebody over the real or virtual threshold to Citizens Advice is often only one part of the problems that they're dealing with. On average, people who come to us have got 6 different interconnected problems. And in the same way, the regulatory landscape is, it is, as I say, it's an ecosystem, and we see 4 different things, all of which need to be in place to make it work properly. The first is, the regulator with the right parameters for the regulator. Then companies who are genuinely trying to work for the interests of consumers and who are engaging. When you have a need for redress, an ombudsman who can get that redress, and also where things need enforcement can push those back to the regulator. And then this vital bit of an independent consumer voice, so somebody who can both stand on the side of individual consumers to help them to resolve issues if the company has not yet managed to do that in the way it should, but can also help people navigate through the system, gathering, make sure that the right cases get to the ombudsman and the wrong cases don't, and gathering insights that can help the regulator to adjust and get the right balance of those different incentives. And I think what we see, if where those 4 pillars aren't in place or aren't properly in balance, people suffer. And in every market, the people who suffer most are the people who are in the most difficult circumstances. It is a universal truth that life is not a level playing field, and if you have got no money to start with, then you are going to find that all of these things are against you. If you will be time poor as well, you will not have the cognitive bandwidth to go and hustle for the things that the system wants you to hustle for. So that's what we see in particular. So we support all consumers, but we see in particular that people on low incomes, people in vulnerable circumstances, people just trying to make life work, are the first to suffer. Those who need the support most are often missed in the system when systems don't talk to each other. And I think so that's the key thing. So in terms of priorities for regulation, it's really making sure that that those basic things are met, things work, people have redress when they need it, they can access the right support, whether that is goods that are safe and don't blow up in your face, whether that's services that do what they're supposed to do, whether that's bills that are not excessive, whether that's making sure that the right infrastructure is being built, but also having the right engagement with all of the different parties.
Thank you very much. We're going to come to questions shortly, but I want to just start with hopefully a briefer round of questions with the panel, just looking at regulatory responsiveness to innovation and change. And Caleb, to start with you, what role does government like to see regulators play in terms of both responding to and promoting innovation in their sectors? And is there legislative change needed to enable them to do better, structural change needed, or is that something that can develop organically?
Thanks, Matthew. Look, it's obviously really important to look at the role regulators play in supporting innovation. Clearly, it differs a bit from sector to sector. Does it require legislative change? Well, the Minister spoke of a couple of things that we are doing in the Regulation for Growth Bill that we're bringing forward that absolutely speak to this. So he talked about the sandbox power, which is really looking at particularly what's been possible in financial services and the way that's supported fintech in the UK. And I think there's a lot of scope to support regulators in being more responsive to testing in a safe environment, new ways of doing things, new technologies, and then being able to scale those. And that's part of making the UK an attractive place to come and develop those sort of technologies and a market where they can be rolled out. So that's one aspect. The other thing that's in that bill is strengthening the growth duty. And there is a growth duty, as you said earlier, David, already in existence, but it's a very weak one. And it means that it's just lost in the sort of plethora of other requirements on regulators. And the idea of strengthening that, giving it more teeth, more akin to the sort of FCA sort of secondary duty, and supplementing it, really importantly, with growth goals for each regulator that are specific to what they do and that have that sort of political judgment from ministers, which is crucial, that helps regulators make the trade-offs. And that would be the sort of thing that you talked about earlier, Katie, in food standards, of having a mandate to pursue a particular technology that you need to have from government. So that's part of the sort of message that we're seeking to give to regulators. And then I just think there's a huge importance in improving the dialogue with companies. And that's part of what David Willicks is doing with the Regulatory Innovation Office, and really going at early stage, like where we're supporting companies with innovation grants. So we're actually linking them up with the regulation system, so when they want to come to market, they can do it. And then just the final thing I would say is about pace and speed. That really matters. Like, how long does it take to get through this? How long does it take to get a license? Because that can be kind of life or death for a business. And in a sort of more mundane element for the CMA than what Michael was talking about earlier, one of their responses to our push on growth is a program of looking at making processes faster, more predictable, more proportionate, and things like just cutting the time it takes to do a merger review, which again is really important for companies moving forward in their bottom line.
Great, thank you. Natalie, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on what regulators can do in practice to promote innovative activity, but I also wanted to put to you the devil's advocate question, which has been upvoted online. So an anonymous question asking, how concerned should we really be about this constant framing of regulation as a barrier? Isn't it inevitable that some businesses prefer not to bear the full cost of their externalities, and regulation will always be unpopular as a result? So actually it's your job to stop stuff happening.
Well, I was going to reflect that it's a lonely plight being a regulator sometimes, because you're in a harm reduction business. That's what you do. Regulators are there to manage harm. Government generally has decided that harm needs to be prevented actively, that the market won't stop it itself. So basically, if you are doing an outstanding job, no one will notice you at all, because everything will just work. You'll probably get no credit, minimal recognition, but you won't cause anybody any trouble. The reality is that things do go wrong, and the more risk regulators are asked to tolerate, the bigger the thing is that goes wrong, and then usually it'll be your leadership hauled up in front of a select committee or summarily sacked, which will be the career ending for you. So I have some sympathy with why regulators tend to be sometimes characterised as risk averse. But let's look at the positives. So regulators, or all the regulators I know, work really hard to work with each other. They try very, 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 very hard indeed. And there are often lots of practical difficulties why they don't. David talked about water. 2 regulators with overlapping responsibilities given diametrically opposite priorities. It's hardly surprising that things didn't work very well. And I'm really pleased to see there's been real progress in dealing with all of that. The other thing is there can often be a disconnect in practice between regulators who often have deep pockets of expertise, because staff tend to stay long term with regulators, so you develop deep sectoral expertise, understanding of your own industry, which is often different from policymakers. And I think there's an opportunity missed for policymakers and regulators to be a bit more sleeves rolled up in how they work together to solve what are quite difficult problems. In practice, regulators can often get set in their ways. That is certainly true, particularly if they're under-resourced, particularly if they lack capability, or if they've had brain drains, as some regulators do. Resourcing is really, really challenging. I mean, it was great for Katie to talk about an innovation project, but I know regulators who can barely keep their computers working. So very difficult for them to set aside capacity to say, actually, we need to have a more creative response because industry is changing. And there is a definite lack of risk sharing. And I think there's a real opportunity there for, if government wants regulators to take more risk, and I think they do need to, in reality, to be really, really clear about that. And for regulators to get some top cover from government when things inevitably go wrong, which they will. So I think that there is huge opportunity, drawing on that capacity, drawing on that capability, having a more joined-up approach for dealing with problems, because industry is constantly changing, and some regulators are in a much better place to respond to that because of the nature of their powers. They've got more discretion to adapt, and others are working under very complex, very rigid regulatory frameworks, where really what they need to be able to do is take the evidence, this is not working in practice, up to legislators who can help resolve that, and that should be a constant iteration. Government should be regularly reviewing its regulatory frameworks and having appetite for sometimes not very exciting, but probably very consequential amendments that will make the system work more effectively.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Michael, I'm going to also kind of shoehorn in another question from online for you, which is on this theme of innovation, but in the context of the questions about Brexit that Gill was raising in the previous session. So this is from Steve C. And he says, how do we get the balance right between avoiding regulatory lag with our closest trading partner, the EU, that costs businesses and consumers money, whilst retaining what he calls the semblance of post-Brexit freedom to set our own regulations?
Well, it's a very good question. It contains within it two assumptions. The first is, to what extent should one wish to keep pace? And the second is, to what extent should one wish to diverge? So one is the passive acceptance of the regulatory orbit of an extremely valuable trading partner. And then the other is an active choice to take a different course when a step is made. My preference, and it's a bias, straightforward prejudice, is that one should always be looking for the opportunity of divergence. That doesn't mean that one always wants to take it. But whatever view one takes of Brexit, having made this bed, one might as well, or one should, lie on it imaginatively. And in a variety of different intriguing positions. End of metaphor. We've already done that. So it is the case, this is less a matter of regulation, though it's linked to regulation, that Clare and I helped to design a new approach towards environmental regulation. We took the opportunity to design a new approach towards how we regulate fisheries and management of our seas, and how we regulate agriculture and the responsibilities, but also the incentives for farmers. More broadly, there is a change which, small in itself, may be significant economically, which relates to precision breeding, the gene editing, which could be, some would argue, a second green revolution. Others say actually will amount to very little, but still, it seems to be that the potential is definitely worth grasping. It's already the case that on digital markets and on AI, I believe that we are seeing the benefits from being outside the EU's regulatory orbit in respect of investment and innovation. But obviously, I could be proven wrong in that regard. And it is also the case that within financial services, even though we haven't taken as divergent an approach as we might have done, the current consensus, doesn't mean it's right, within financial services, is that re-entering the EU's regulatory orbit more fully would be a mistake. But ultimately, it is a case-by-case judgment. And it relates to one other thing as well, which is that for the EU itself, regulation is a weapon. I don't mean that in a bad way. But in essence, what the single market does, as well as creating theoretical and in some cases real efficiencies for all of its members, is that it is a way of subduing neighbours, aspirants and others by saying, if you want to have access to this market, then you need to accept this type of or this shape of regulation. And the EU is not a superpower in military terms, but it is a regulatory superpower. So actually, if you have a big enough market and you have determined and skilled enough negotiators, then regulation as a means of access to your market can become an economic and diplomatic tool.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, as Michael said, Clare, you dealt with a lot of regulatory change during Brexit. Do you think that the accountability and independence of regulators needs to look different at times of rapid change or even public frustration?
I think if you flip that question over and say, should they be somehow less accountable or less independent when there isn't rapid change, or more accountable or more independent, it doesn't really work. I mean, accountability is really important. Independence is very important. But ultimately, as I was saying before, I mean, the architecture is set by politicians, and there isn't a world in which you can say there is complete independence. And some of the moments that we've seen when necessary change has happened have been when ministers have said to regulators, you really need to do something about this. Notably, the The forced installation of prepayment meters, which was a big issue. Citizens Advice had been drawing that to the attention of all sorts of people for some time. It hadn't attracted attention. Actually, it took a very good investigative journalist going undercover to create a story, which then set in chain events which have been, really genuinely beneficial for people, because they now don't get their houses broken into, and Ofgem rewrote the rules in a way which was, thoughtful and careful. So there are examples like that about actually, it is independence, but it's not complete independence. I think possibly the interesting thing about times of kind of rapid change and frustration is that possibly the hardest thing for a regulator to do all the time is to judge the moment to act and the degree, how far to go and when to do it. And I think that the prepayment meter is one good example. There is a temptation when stuff happens, when there is rapid change, particularly when there's political frustration, for government, whether it's a regulator or politicians, to say something must happen, and to find, so if one thing goes wrong, to create a very, very sophisticated solution to make sure that very, very specific thing can never happen again, but not actually to look at the root causes so something else can go wrong. So sometimes it's action too quickly, not quite thought through. The flip side, as well as my prepayment meter. So I joined Citizens Advice in 2021. In April, and in the autumn of 2021, energy companies started failing. Nothing to do with my arrival, as far as I know. But it turned out that my very brilliant policy colleagues had been writing reports since 2013 predicting that exactly this was going to happen, because they could see energy companies were insufficiently capitalised, they were using customer credit balances as their working capital, they were neglecting customer services. So all of the signals, not just the signals were there, the signals were being very much brought to the forefront, but it didn't quite have, it didn't feel urgent enough, and so things weren't done until a bunch of companies had fallen over and a load of customers had suffered the detriment of that happening. So I think that's the really interesting issue, and obviously the faster things are changing and the more spikes there are in public opinion, the harder it is to make those judgments.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much, Claire. So we've now got time for some questions. Are there any questions in the room? If you are in the adjoining room and have a question, please just come through and put your head around the doors and we can take questions from there as well. So I've got Miles and Guy and a gentleman directly behind Miles.
Miles Baker, former financial services regulator. Quick question to the panel. Is judicial review the elephant in the room here? We've talked about the risk appetite of regulators. We've talked about, a gentleman from Water UK talked about the appeals processes. We can currently see the FCA being sued for its motor finance scheme by both purported representatives of consumers on the one hand and businesses on the other over exactly the same problem, and it's delaying payouts to customers. So is judicial review the elephant in the room?
Thank you. Do you want to pass the microphone back just while it's in that part of the room?
Yeah, Tony Balance from Caden. I just wanted to link some of the comments here to what the Minister said earlier and ask a couple of questions. So the Minister was talking about the need for growth duty, the need for independence and autonomy, as Michael talked about, of regulators, but the need for government to issue strategic advice from time to time. And my concern being, if you want autonomy, you've got to get the government out of the frame. So that would be one question. The other question is, growth seems a very ambiguous term, and Michael, is the growth duty the wrong thing for regulators to be pursuing? It's not such a binary question, but you get the essence of what I'm digging at.
Thank you. And Guy.
Thank you. Guy Thompson. I'm a board member at the Orders Gate Group, which represents a business voice on progressive regulation to enable a fair and efficient transition to a green economy. And my question, I'm afraid I've got two questions in one as well, Matthew. Very quickly, my broad brush question, just reflecting on Michael's point about political leadership and the role of politicians in setting the parameters of regulation, is how is our regulatory framework coping with the need to encompass emerging markets and also increasingly complex problems that like climate change that require more collaboration across the economy. Is that actually the nub of the issue at the heart of our political economy, is my contention. And then secondly, just on a specific use case, Michael and Claire, you respectively, as in your incarnations as former Environment Secretary and Permanent Sec at DEFRA, my contention was some of the best aspects of the post-Brexit framework at DEFRA relate back to your time at respective time at DEFRA. Have we sufficiently utilised that opportunity for the flexibility to catalyse investment, private investment in these environmental improvement targets? The decoupling of agricultural subsidies was an opportunity in that regard. I obviously have a view, but I think I'd be fascinated to hear your reflections on whether we've gone far enough and fast enough in that regard.
Thanks very much. So, judicial review, growth duty, and complex problems, I guess. Shall I start on this side, because you were scribbling away in response to Guy?
Yeah, no. So, in order, on judicial review, yes. So, in a nutshell, judicial review is a vital democratic safeguard, but it has suffered from creep in all sorts of ways. I believe that it requires dealing with in a variety of ways, but it is technical and important in maintaining that balance. But you are right that the way in which some courts and some judges and some groups have used it has meant that the original scope, which is to deal with maladministration or executive overreach, has been significantly stretched. On the growth duty, I couldn't agree more. It is so elastic. It sounds great. But as I tried to say with respect to the CMA, and indeed it applies to other regulators as well, there are different theories about how growth is achieved. It's the responsibility of government to be more specific about how the remit that it gives to a regulator will contribute to growth and how that balances against other considerations. So just a simple amorphous growth duty is a motherhood and apple pie duty. But it's better that politicians are thinking about it than not, to be fair to the Minister. And then the Guy's points, I completely agree. So first of all, on environment, I think it is the case that, just talking about DEFRA overall, some of the momentum after George Eustace went was lost, and that's because the increasingly powerless Conservative political position meant that more time was spent on looking after farmers as an interest group, perfectly legitimate, rather than thinking more imaginatively, and then the misstep over both the funding of the Sustainable Farming Initiative and inheritance tax meant that Steve Reed and Emma Reynolds, both good ministers, I think, found themselves in a position where they were constrained. So there is an opportunity to restore momentum and thought to how one uses environmental policy and environmental regulation to promote sustainable growth in a better way. Linked to that, and an even bigger elephant in the room, which I didn't touch on, is artificial intelligence overall, because some of the things that we alluded to in the discussion on growth are brought powerfully into play by AI, and there's a link with the environment as well. What is it that we can regulate as a sovereign, and what should we? And what is it that we want to have a voice in contributing to the regulation of, even though, as a sovereign, our control is limited?
Thank you. Claire, I think you were going to come back on some of those points, and then Caleb will come to you on...
Yes, I won't cover all of those, but there were just a few things. So I think this point about growth and whether the growth is the wrong measure is really interesting. And I mean, when Michael and I were in DEFRA, I think we spent a lot of time countering the narrative that you could either have growth in the economy or you could have a healthy environment. Yeah. And we just sat there endlessly saying a healthy economy needs a healthy environment needs a healthy economy. I would say now, exactly the same thing applies in relation to consumers. Health growth depends on consumers wanting to and feeling confident to engage in the market. So this sense of, and then some of the rhetoric around boots on the necks of is not helpful, because sorry, I just dropped my microphone. So it just creates this idea that it's one or the other, and the two things absolutely go hand in hand. So I think the more we can get back to the two things being seen as mutually reinforcing, the better. The other thing, I was like Michael, I was going to pick up on AI, because I think, and I don't know if this came up earlier, I mean, I think around the system, complaint systems are breaking. Everyone we talk to is saying they're seeing more complaints, and we are indeed, even as an advice agency, seeing more complaints, longer complaints, often having hallucinated case law, which they then cite. There is a real issue around how that works. We are also seeing what we call AI slop. So if people want advice, they go to ChatGPT, it tells them what to do, they do what it tells them, it gets them into trouble, they then come to systems advice with a much worse problem than the one that they originally had. And we're really interested in how we can create safe advice. But all of that goes directly into how are we between us going to make a very, very differently configured markets work.
Thank you, Claire. Caleb.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on this grace duty point, because it's true, as lots of people said, that it just sort of in abstract is nebulous, and you need to have more for regulators to act on it. The first thing to say is it's not going to be the primary duty of most regulators, because they're going to be there for protecting the environment or something. But in the way that they do it, are they thinking about growth? So that's our sort of new legislation, is to give that a stronger hook. And then the onus is on government to say, well, what does that mean in your specific case? And I would commend our Regulation Action Plan Progress Update that we published last week, because within it, it does set out the first set of growth goals that government has given particular regulators. So if you look at what we're saying to the CAA, it's about particular aspects of drones and future flight and what we'd like them to do to support that. And if you look at NICE and the MHRA, they're being asked to work more closely together to provide a better pathway for innovative technologies into the NHS. And I think you have got to get at that sort of level of specificity. And it also speaks to that sort of balance between regulatory independence and the right sort of political steer on the trade-offs that actually, elected governments are there to make. So it's work in progress, definitely, but that is what we are trying to do at the moment.
Thank you. Natalie, did you have anything to add?
All I would say is I do think unless growth is articulated well, it's not going to help anything. However, what I've seen, particularly in the environment sector in response to your innovation challenge, is regulators really seizing an opportunity to secure investment and bring focus to improving their operations. Because generally speaking, that's what will make the biggest difference to businesses, is having regulators that can make decisions more quickly, that can share data more accessibly, that they are well supported by IT infrastructure, so they've got an effective system. And I've seen multiple regulators seize the opportunity to make that case for government, and I think that will have a real and practical impact. But it's not about growth in the abstract, it's about regulators doing their jobs more effectively, more efficiently, more quickly, better public services, better public facing. So if we look at it through that lens, I think it could present some real opportunity. But having competing duties that are very difficult to reconcile or which are unclear is not helpful. So I'm very pleased to hear you say that. It's good.
Thank you, Natalie. I think we've got time for one more round of questions. There was somebody next door who put their head round if they would like to come back. Do we have anybody who is not a man who would like to ask a question? So this gentleman and Michael, and if any non-men could just think if they would like to add themselves to the list.
Hello, Tim Hawkins from Yorkshire Water. I feel a bit like the guy on a Swiss clock appearing in the room, so thank you for taking my question. Really interested in the topic of strategic guidance and trade-offs, and doing quite a lot of thinking about that. I think everybody agrees that would be beneficial. There's a real need for that kind of guidance, but the one thing it really needs is courage to make those difficult strategic choices. And I just wonder whether the panel have got any thoughts or advice on where that courage comes from for ministers to make those kinds of choices, particularly between bills and outcomes that are equally desirable. So interested in the thoughts from the panel.
Thank you. And Michael?
Hi, I'm Mike Ranton. I'm Deputy Chief Regulator at Ofqual. So thank you for your comments, Michael. I was just thinking that I do believe that regulation can really help in context of innovation. It's flexible, it's responsive, building on Natalie's points. And I think that comes when there's good legislation, rule-making powers, sector expertise, and political clarity. I just wondered, are we doing enough to recognise when regulation works really well? And are we actually drawing on that when we're creating new regulators in particular?
Thank you. And we've got 2 more questions we'll squeeze in really quickly. There's one just here and one by the door again.
So I'm going to ask an age-old question that I don't think we fixed. I'm Randa Biddle from the Independent Monitoring Authority for Citizens' Rights, because if you're in an ALB, you can't have a snappy little title. I'm really interested to hear how we can collectively build alliances across public service delivery to deliver growth. Because at ministerial level, there still isn't always join up. So if we need growth in one area, you've got to fix health, education, skills, everything else to make that work well. As regulators, we're not always joined up. So there's still regulator overlap between different sectors. And if we're looking at champion trust from citizens, again, it's a very mixed market. So I'd be really interested to hear from the panel, how can we become more collective rather than siloed in our approach to growth?
Thank you. And finally, a question by the door.
Thank you. I'm Mariam from the ICO. And actually, building on your point there, I wanted to ask, are there good examples of where government regulators who haven't pulled for the regulatory lever straight away and regulators have worked together? At the Information Commissioner's Office, I remember lots of debates around creating an AI regulator, and a bunch of regulators, including Ofcom, CMA, pulled together and created the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum to try and create a single front door for businesses needing to operate. And second point quickly is England's playing tonight. Next week is the first anniversary of the independent football regulator, the newest regulator in the club. So there you go. We keep growing.
Thank you. So we've got finding the courage to do strategic guidance well, recognising good regulation, regulators solving cross-cutting problems together, and good examples of cooperation amongst regulators. Feel free to be selective, panel, on this, but who would like to start? Claire?
I'm happy to start, and I'm not going to try and answer all of those questions, but I think the alliances across government departments is a really interesting question, and it goes far wider than regulation. One of the things that I find fascinating in citizens' advice, as I say, we're very holistic. We deal with people as people, and there is no part of government that looks at people as people. No, every part of government, and I say this having spent several decades exactly in this environment, you look down your lens at the portion of a person that intersects with the sector that you're dealing with. And there are all sorts of structural accountability incentives why government finds it really hard to join up. And I think all of those apply to regulation too. Now, I know regulators, there's the regulators get together to have conversations about cross-cutting issues. I guess my simple advice would be often talk to civil society, because we are often the intercostal muscles joining things up across different areas. And often we have a lot of interest in, one way or another, almost all charities will have an interest in what regulators are doing. So that might be at least a route of conversations. And then I think the point about finding good regulation and really trying to learn from that. There are all sorts of great examples. If you come at it, as Natalie was saying, regulation is about preventing harm, and in many cases, there is visible harm and you can see it being changed. So, as well as it being the one-year anniversary of the football regulator, today is the entry into force of regulation of buy now, pay later, which is an interesting example because it does cause a lot of harm to some people. Unregulated buy now, pay later, fine for lots of people, but for a group of people who find that they've taken out buy now, pay later without realising, didn't realise it was a credit agreement, they end up with the bailiffs on their door, they get into debt because no one was checking affordability. So there is a group of people for whom that harm will be mitigated. And so I think finding those examples and just kind of distilling them out, really good idea.
Thank you, Claire. Michael?
Good regulators do exist, I'm tempted to say that if the Institute for Government doesn't do it, that we should set up a new body to look at all of the regulators that there are and to grade and to rank and to inspect them. We could call it off-off. But my own person, I would award high marks personally to the OEP and to Ofqual. I think that both of them really have worked very well. I mean, I'm biased because I've worked with them and admire the people who worked in them. I think Ofsted was very good, but first controversial statement. Ofsted has become weaker as a result of the political and public pressure following the tragic death of a head teacher. And it's an example of an individual tragedy leading not to an potential overhaul of internal systems to ensure greater personal sensitivity, but actually a retreat from what was its right mission. Second, potentially controversial opinion. Am I right in thinking that the Independent Monitoring Authority was the body that was set up after Brexit in order to guarantee the rights of EU citizens in the EU? I'm so sorry to say this. It shouldn't exist. Because my own view is that the implication that the UK couldn't be trusted to look after the rights of EU citizens on its own with its own institutions and that we required another body, I think was wrong. Now, once a body is set up, you need good people to run it effectively, to discharge the remit. The fact that it was set up was a politician's decision, but I'm not sure, because I think that this is another thing that can be a tendency with a problem identified to say we need a new body. I don't think it was a problem, but even if it was, why wouldn't it be the case that the courts dealt with it? That takes me to the football regulator. That is totally unnecessary. I do not know what the problem is that it is setting out to solve and can solve proportionate to the establishment of the regulator. And the final thing that I would say is that even if you disagree with me on both of those things, anyone who is interested in sport and regulation, anyone, should read a marvellous book by Daisy Christodoulou, which is a study of the impact, hilarious, brilliant and thoughtful study of the impact of VAR on football. Because what it talks about is not just football and VAR, but the contrast between what is right according to the rules and what feels right according to the heart. It's only 90 minutes long in terms of reading. I know I've been there. So all I would say is that apart from IFG reports, and indeed the work of the people on this panel, it's one of the best things that you can read about when, and that, exactly, it's one of the best things you can read in this vexed area. So before I make any more enemies, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Caleb.
I'll be really quick, but I just wanted to come back on the question about joining up, because it is an important one, and because I think there's two opportunities at the moment that we should try and grasp, and one is doing more in a place-based way, and I think there's definitely an opportunity coming for that, isn't there? But there's definitely a more tractable problem, and we've been seeking to do that, for example, with rogue businesses and Companies House and the Fair Work Agency working together locally. And then the other one is technology, because that should make some of this simpler. So, if you're a business and you've got to interface with lots of different regulators, now the job of bringing all those regulators together is a mammoth task, but the job of having a digital front door that makes it look a bit more like that, is something that is within our reach, I think, in the coming years. And so that's another exciting opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Caleb. A final word for you, Natalie.
Just a bit of a provocation, I think. I love regulation. I love it. I think it's an incredibly fascinating discipline, and you get to deliver really good things for people. So I absolutely love it. But it's never been really seen in government as a profession. And I've been really pleased to see the Institute for Regulation get in the vanguard of that, because bringing regulators together from different sectors is one of the most powerful things we can do. When I was leading the setup of the OEP, many regulators gave very freely of their time to help us learn. There's no new problems, essentially, is what I've discovered. And I try and be a leader in the sector and be a good corporate citizen. So I've done teach-ins on one of our innovations to 24 different public authorities. And I really want to see that, because I think that could be so powerful that we can build that community of practice, because I think that we are much stronger together, and I would encourage anyone who works in regulation to be a leader in regulation and join up with your ever-expanding cohort, because it's exciting. It's an exciting business to be in.
Thank you, Natalie. That is a great note to end on. It's been such a rich discussion. We've not only run out of time, we've gone over. Thank you so much to all of the panel for a really wonderful conversation. Caleb Deeks, Natalie Prosser, Michael Gove, Clare Moriarty. For those of you online, the conference continues at 4:20 with a session on creating a regulatory system that attracts investment. You'll find the link on the website, and we'll be in the capable hands of our senior fellow Giles Wilkes. Do join us for that. Meanwhile, enjoy the break.